I have Camilla Royle here today, who's Deputy Editor of International Socialism Journal, and without further ado.
Thanks. So I thought I'd talk about what the Anthropocene is and what some of the debates around it are, but also talk about the Marxism side of it and what we can learn from Marx and Engels. You know, these two people who were born around 200 years ago now, why are their ideas still relevant to understanding the environmental crises that we face today? Of course, climate change is a central environmental issue of our time, I would argue, not the only environmental issue that we face, but one that's quite central. The UN reported last year that it would be extremely difficult to avoid temperature rises of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We really only have 12 years, or actually it's less than 12 years now, to stop that happening. We're already heading for that degree of temperature rise. One consequence of this is that in 2018, temperature of the oceans actually reached its highest point that's ever been recorded, and the effect of this is that tropical cyclones are becoming more frequent, more intense, and delivering more rainfall. So Cyclone Idai, which hit southern Africa earlier this year, with a death toll of 1,200 people at least, gives an idea of the kind of thing that we can expect to see more of. Because of this, scientists are increasingly taking seriously the idea that human activity has pushed the planet into a new epoch. So the Anthropocene, to define it in a sentence, is a geological epoch defined by global human influence over Earth system processes. In other words, a future geologist, thousands of years from now, if they were able to look back at today's time and look in the sediments and things and look at the evidence from ice cores, they would see some evidence globally of the effect that humans are having in this period of time. The way this chart works is this is how geologists divide up time. So they divide it into eons. We're in the Phanerozoic eon. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, and then you can see it's further divided up into 3 eras, which are further divided up into periods. This kind of Cenozoic period, everything from the dinosaurs onwards, is further divided up into the Cenozoic era is further divided up into periods. We're in the Quaternary period, and you can eventually divide that up into Pleistocene and Holocene. Humans only turned up towards the end of the Pleistocene, really, and the Holocene started 11,500 years ago. So this is the conventional way of dividing it up. So we would say that we're in the Holocene, but there are there's a working group of geologists that have been set up to debate whether we're actually in the Anthropocene. They now, it's a majority of them think that we are in the Anthropocene, and actually a majority of them think now that the Anthropocene started 50 or 60 years ago, middle of the 20th century basically, which is extraordinary really for people that are used to dealing with timescales of millions of years to start thinking about a new epoch starting some decades ago. The modern kind of interpretation of the Anthropocene has been associated with Crutzen and Stormer, and Paul Crutzen is one of the scientists responsible for discovering what we were doing to the ozone layer, as a Nobel Prize winning chemist. It's actually an older idea though, so people have raised the idea that Vladimir Vernadsky, a scientist working in the Soviet Union, a very interesting person, actually already had the idea that we were in a global epoch defined by human influence. There's, according to Peter Linnebau, there was a 19th century Italian priest and geologist, Antonio Stoppani, who also came up with a similar idea. But in terms of the modern kind of interpretation of the Anthropocene, the working group is still working on making a formal proposal, and they're looking for a place around the globe that could act as a marker for when the Anthropocene started. And they're thinking that you could probably find evidence of testing of nuclear weapons in tree rings and things, so that might be an appropriate kind of marker for when the Anthropocene started, but it doesn't mean that's the most important thing that happened in the Anthropocene. So what does this mean for us? Well, quite scarily, it means that we're potentially no longer in the Holocene. As I said, that's a period that lasted for about 11,500 years. Holocene conditions are the only conditions that we know are compatible with complex human civilizations. This is the period of time in which civilization has developed. So if you look at the Pleistocene, the temperature, it's also known as the Ice Age, the temperature veers up and down quite dramatically. Once you get into the Holocene, there's been a quite stable temperature, and arguably that has been quite useful for human development. So if we're leaving the Holocene, potentially entering a period that will be marked by unpredictable changes in temperature and will be quite an unpredictable and dangerous situation. It also means, if you accept the Anthropocene argument, it means at some point in the past there's been a profound shift in the nature and the extent of the way humans modify our environments. Humans have existed for a couple of 100,000 years, but at some point in the last few decades, very, very recently, there's been some kind of qualitative shift in the extent to which we are affecting the environment around us and the way in which we're affecting it. And we know that there are quantitative changes that can turn into qualitative shifts in the way we think about this. Know that climate change can lead to tipping points, for example. So I think it can be quite, people don't take it seriously that it happened in the last 50 years. So Will Stephan, who's one of the scientists associated with this project, has said that the last 50 years have without doubt seen the most rapid transformation of the human relationship with the natural world in the history of the species. So even very air that we breathe in at the moment is notably different from the air that our grandparents breathed in even 50 years ago. I mean, one kind of striking, these are all different changes that have happened, and you see in quite a lot of different measures of environmental change, there seems to be a kind of something sharply going upwards in the past 50 years. One striking measure of this is that things like plastic. Plastic was invented towards the early 20th century with Bakelite and things, but the mass production of plastic bottles, plastic bags, really only took off around the time of the Second World War and afterwards, and yet the extent to which plastic has infiltrated the environment is so great that they're now 7 miles down in the Mariana Trench. There's very little area of the globe's surface that doesn't have plastic on it. It's not just an issue for natural historians. I've talked about scientists, but of course if we're talking about human civilizations and changes in human societies, this also means that this is an issue that historians and social scientists ought to engage with. And there's lots of debates about when the Anthropocene started, what happened to human society that made it happen. I'll go into these in more detail in my chapter in the System Change for Climate Change book, but I think there are, for some it was the quote-unquote discovery of the New World that kicked off the Anthropocene, when there was a massive drop actually in carbon dioxide levels, because a lot of people in South America actually died, and you had reforestation that reduced the carbon dioxide very quickly. You had species being moved around the world in an unprecedented way. And some people say it was more to do with the invention of the steam engine in Britain and its use in the rapid expansion of coal power. I think it's possible to say that there was something that happened in the middle of the 20th century, but that didn't come out of nowhere, that there were earlier changes in society and earlier shifts that put us on the path towards that 20th century uptick, or great acceleration as it's often called. There are some wrong ways of looking at the Anthropocene though, and I think for good reason. Some on the left have actually been quite sceptical about the idea of an Anthropocene. For some, I mean, because it comes from the word anthropos, meaning human, it's seen as the age of humans, and it's seen to imply that all human beings are to blame for this problem. Because we should reject this idea. Just as one example, the energy consumption of someone living in Canada is 1,000 times greater than a farmer living in the Sahel region. So it's not the fault of all humans. There's also the kind of related idea that this is something to do with human nature. So Mark Linus, quite well-known environmentalist, says that instead of Homo sapiens, we should be called Homo pyrophilus, the kind of the fire ape, or the species that just loves fire. So as soon as we figured out that we could burn things, that was kind of seen as putting us on this kind of this route towards the Anthropocene. That it was always in our nature to go along that route, and that was just always going to happen. It was inevitable. Andreas Malm's book Fossil Capital actually dispenses with this argument quite effectively by going into detail about how it wasn't actually inevitable that humanity would adopt fossil fuels. There are actually much more useful forms of powering society, including using water wheels and renewable energy. But fossil fuels were adopted in England at a particular time because that suited the ruling class. So I'd recommend that book in particular. And there are also apolitical accounts of the Anthropocene, which I also think are a problem. The idea that because human influence is global, because everyone in the globe is to some extent affected by climate change, then we're all in it together, really. This is a situation for the whole of humanity to come together and try and solve. And you hear this from a range of sources, really, including from environmentalists, and I think you can see why it's kind of attractive. We want to involve everyone in environmental activism, everyone from bankers at the top of society to school students and workers can be part of it. It can seem to kind of widen the scope of potential solutions to the problem. But I think actually it can also tend away from the most radical solutions. So if you're trying to come up with solutions that are suitable to everyone and mutually agreeable to everyone from a banker to a school student, then you're really kind of limiting the scope of solutions. If what we think the solution is to shut down the fossil fuel companies, stop digging it out of the ground and stop burning it, that's not going to be in everyone's interest. The bankers and the people that run those companies, unfortunately, don't have the interest in shutting them down. It's kind of something called post-political approaches to the Anthropocene can also be, they can kind of reduce the problem down and turn it away from a discussion of what's wrong with society towards this discussion of what kind of technology we can use, because again, that's kind of mutually agreeable. We could all be part of the debate about technology, and they can sort of turn towards discussions of things like geoengineering. So Paul Crutzen, who is one of the originators of the Anthropocene idea, as I said, is quite an advocate of geoengineering, spraying sulphur into the atmosphere and trying to solve the problem that way. I say it's not a problem with lack of technology, it's a social problem. So if there are so many kind of wrong arguments, arguments about we're all to blame, it's human nature, those kind of things associated with the Anthropocene, is there any point in hanging on to this idea? Is there any reason to argue that we're in the Anthropocene? I want to say that there is still a reason to take note of these ideas, and not just reject them out of hand. I mean, firstly, because for one thing, there is credible scientific evidence that this is happening, and it's not just climate change, it's species extinction has also gone up in that past in the sort of period since the mid-20th century, for example, and multiple other environmental issues. We shouldn't just ignore what the scientists are saying about this. And Marx and Engels, in their own time, wouldn't have ignored scientists. They were really interested in science, as Ian Angus read about in his book. They're interested in Darwin, in chemistry, in geology. Actually, Marx read a little bit about geology, and Engels kind of knew about everything. It's a complete polymath. So to come on to Marx and Engels, I mean, they didn't understand global climate change as a kind of political issue as we do now. I say global climate change because they did understand a bit about localised climate change. So deforestation can cause higher temperatures and lower humidity in a local area. There's another book by Khai Saito called Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, which I recommend again, which looks at what Marx did actually know about, and he actually makes the argument that Marx's ecological thinking was actually central to his political economy, so we should pay much more attention to what Marx said about ecology. It wasn't really published, a lot of it. He was reading an incredible amount, like soil science, for example, and he was trying to integrate that into his overall project of understanding how capitalism works in Capital. But he didn't publish that much about ecology, and he left us with only a few hints about what an ecological Marxism might look like. I think what there is that Marx wrote is still quite profound, though. I think if Marx and Engels were around today, it would have been evident to them that it's not humans in general that are responsible for climate change and other environmental problems, but it's humans organised in a particular kind of society. I think that's, it's pretty clear really from those graphs and things that human beings have existed for 200,000 years. We've got to have an explanation for why is it only now in the past few decades that this is happening, the Anthropocene. They recognise that you can't separate out humans from their environment. All humans are essentially a part of nature, but we also act on nature and change the rest of the natural environment by acting and by our labour power. I've got the quote from Marx in chapter 7 of Capital. Says that labour is a process between man and nature, or humans and nature, process by which, through our own actions, we mediate, regulate and control metabolism between ourselves and nature. Man sets in motion the natural forces which belong to his own body, his arms, legs, head and hands, in order to appropriate the materials of nature in a form adapted to his own needs. But importantly, he also acts upon external nature and changes it, and in this way simultaneously changes his own nature. This has been happening even throughout human history. Great thanks. Even in the Holocene, that period of 11,500 years or so, humans have changed the natural environment around us, primarily through agriculture and domesticating different plants and animals. But as we've changed the world around us, the environment, that has also acted back again and changed how human societies work. So during that period, we've been able to establish settled societies, eventually establish big urban areas, cities, complex societies, and the ruling class and the family, and have also been established in that period of time, related to the establishment of agriculture. It seems, more than probable that it was human activity itself that kept the temperature so benign and stable relatively for that period. Of course, there's also been natural disasters, that have affected the poorest people. Engels also argued that it's our human labour that actually also played a role, much earlier in driving human evolution. So in the part played by labour in the transition from ape to man, he talks about how using our hands in order to modify the world around us by creating tools has actually enabled us to grow large brains rather than being the other way around, the brain first before the hand. So Marx and Engels really had a method of understanding human history that talks about human history but doesn't abstract it from natural history and doesn't treat it as separate from the way we relate to the environment. But they also, of course, recognise that we don't just relate to our environment as single individuals. We're social animals that live in societies, and the way we shape the rest of nature is closely related to the type of society in which we live. There's a part in the German ideology, which is Marx and Engels writing together quite early in their careers, where they're criticising people. They're criticising a group called the Young Hegelians, basically people who followed Hegel in Germany, and they criticised someone called Feuerbach, and they said that Feuerbach has a notion of nature but isolated from human activity. But this doesn't actually exist. There's no part of nature that isn't modified and influenced by human activity. Even in their own time, let alone in our time. One example that they give is that Feuerbach sees the essence of a freshwater fish as the water in which it swims. And they say that the pollution that affects the water is bad, and we should get rid of pollution. We should restore the natural habitat of the fish, because that is where a fish naturally lives. All Feuerbach could say is that polluted water is wrong and abnormal, and that clean water must be restored. But Marx and Engels say it's not good enough really just to say that the fish should be back in clean water. We need to have an understanding of essentially why it is that the water came to be polluted in the first place. So in order to do that, you need to understand the social relations involved. You need to understand industrial capitalism, how things like dye works in the 19th century had massively polluted the water. And you need to understand it historically. You need to know how that situation came about. How did we go from a feudal situation to a industrial capitalist situation where that's taking place? I think Engels probably had quite a lot to say about this, because his dad was actually running some of these factories, so he was very familiar with water pollution in the Wupper area of Germany where he grew up. Where one of the first things he wrote was actually about water pollution. He talked about the rivers running red with the dye from all the factories, rather than running red with blood. And then he came to Manchester and noticed the water pollution and the air pollution that was affecting people there. So quite environmental kind of concerns were quite central to Engels' thinking, I think. Marx also said a lot about human nature, rather than, as people like Mark Linus might say, suggesting that human nature is just essentially destructive and that we're always going to be environmentally damaging. Marx and Engels as well talked about the human nature that exists under capitalism as being not the way that humans have always existed, and not necessarily the way that humans will always exist, but capable of living in many different types of societies and in many different ways. So to come on to why is capitalism so different from what came before it? So I've talked about humans always relating to their environment in some ways, but I think we want to understand a qualitative shift that occurred really with capitalism. Capitalism is distinct from the kind of feudal systems that existed before it. It's a dynamic system that involves two factors really that are relevant. Firstly, that workers are no longer tied to the land as they were in feudal times. They're not working in their own small farms and are giving a portion of what they produce to a feudal lord. I think I've got a picture of the kind of situation that people used to live in medieval times. So each farming family has a tiny strip of land, a feudal manor in the middle that's run by the lord. Martin's probably going to correct me if this is all wrong. Lots of common land as well, used held in common. So that was the kind of situation with feudalism. Capitalism is qualitatively different from that because people were removed from the land with things like enclosures really laid the basis for this. People migrated into the cities en masse in places like Britain and other areas. They're no longer running their own industry, making their own clothes and food. They're coming to work for another person. They're selling their labour power to a capitalist. The other thing that characterises capitalism, the second thing, is that it's driven by competition. So the capitalists are, as we know, a band of warring brothers, and they compete with each other in order to secure the greatest profits. And with modern capitalism, then you could see fossil fuel companies becoming incredibly rich and competing with each other almost, to the destruction of the whole, the livability of the planet in order to keep their profits in place. And so capitalism is qualitatively different from the feudal system that came before it. I keep saying qualitatively different, but I think that's kind of the key point to understand. And Marx and Engels understood this. Other people have drawn Marx and Engels' ideas. And I won't go into too much detail because I know Ian Angus is going to speak about the metabolic rift later on in Marxism. But people like John Bellamy Foster and Ian himself have drawn on some of the work of Marx in particular, and shown how with the establishment of capitalism there is what's called a rift in the metabolism between humanity and nature. So all living things have to relate to the world around them, and that's we call that a metabolic relationship. But with the establishment of capitalism, the separation of people from the land, and the kind of rise of people selling their labour power as a commodity, but also seeing parts of the natural environment as a commodity that gets bought and sold for a price. You get a rift in the metabolism with nature. The one thing I'd say about that is that it's a very powerful framework for understanding the effect of capitalism, because it shows how ecological damage is also inevitably linked to the exploitation of workers. Marx said that progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the worker but of robbing the soil. So you can see how alienation of the people that became workers from the land also at the same time created the conditions for ecological disaster. It shows how workers should have an interest also in using our labour power in much better ways. So I think just to conclude on, I think you'll hear a lot at Marxism about the importance of socialists being involved in movements around climate change and other environmental problems. We should be part of groups like Extinction Rebellion, who have really put climate change on the agenda in a way that it hasn't been before, and have been incredibly impressive and inspiring, shutting down the centre of London and moving a massive pink boat into the centre of Oxford Street, and that have drawn thousands of people into their protests. We should be supporting the school strikes, we should throw ourselves into going back into our different workplaces after Marxism's finished, and trying to make the 20th of September into something real, into a climate strike. Trying to raise the issue of people walking out of their workplaces rather than just holding up selfies and things, saying that we support the school strikes. Let's not just leave it to them to go and walk out. We should make sure climate change demands are linked to the anti-racist movement, issues around climate refugees. But I think we should also bring with us the idea that we need to look at capitalism as the problem. We need solutions that to start to challenge the priorities of capitalism. We need solutions that go to the heart of why this drive for profit is putting us all at risk. And I think in order to do that, we also need to look to the ideas of Marx and Engels. If you want to understand capitalism, Marx is the theorist of capitalism and how it works. This is theory that we can use to try and understand the situation that we're in today, but it can also point the way towards a different type of society where production of goods is there to meet human needs rather to meet the need for profit.
I just wanted to firstly say that people who want to know more really should read Camilla's chapter. It's one of the highlights of the System Change book, because I think it really goes into detail of the politics of the Anthropocene, and very important. But I really wanted to emphasise this sense of capitalism as a continuity with the past and a break. I mean, Camilla talked about the Holocene, the era where human society developed. Without the Holocene, without that period of stability, capitalism could not have existed, nor could any of the other pre-class societies. But capitalism arises out. It's a continuity with the past. It's continuity in the sense that humans have had, as Marx has said, that relationship with the natural world. But then it's a break, because it transforms that natural world. It transforms that relationship. It transforms it in an utterly brutal way. The enclosures that Camilla mentioned, the destruction of indigenous life and communities around the world. So we still have a relationship with nature, without which, as Marx pointed out, if we don't have that relationship, our society couldn't exist, we couldn't live. But it's a relationship that's on a completely different basis to any that's historically existed. But I also think the other thing about the Anthropocene debate, which comes out of all these discussions about whether there is an Anthropocene, what date should it have started, and so on, is that we must understand also that capitalism is a dynamic system that has gone through a process of changes as well. And post-World War II, there is a complete transformation again as fossil fuel capitalism gets expanded and driven by American imperialism around the globe, which transforms everything from plastics production to agriculture and so on. And that's why I think the post-World War location for the beginning of the Anthropocene is quite an important thing for us politically to argue for, because it's about a relationship between capitalism and so on. The final thing I want to say is that actually we want to transform that relationship again. The whole concept of socialism is not just a greener, better, nicer capitalism. It is a complete transformation again about our human relationship with the nature, with each other, and so on. That's what we're fighting for. That sustainable future is not a nicer capitalism. It's a much, much better way of organising society, where we plan, as Marx said, rationally our relationship with nature for the interests of everybody and succeeding generations.
Just so comrades know, if people can keep it to 3 minutes, and I'll tap on the desk at 2 minutes, but thank you very much. Comrade in the yellow top behind.
Thanks for the really interesting meeting, Camilla. Yeah, I just think... Anyway. All right. Oh. Yeah, I just think, just going on, I guess, a bit more about the human nature argument. It's just, the idea that it's sort of natural for people to just want to destroy everything. I mean, it's interesting because I've just had my family visiting from Australia, and my stepdad has gone from being a farmer to working in a coal mine due to the fact that obviously not investing in farms, and there's no money in farms, there's massive droughts. And it was interesting to see the contradictions in someone who's in that, how their interests change. Even though he's in one of the most severe droughts that they've ever experienced in their life, he is also still defending his job and saying, but it was this hot back in 73 and there's always been drought in Australia, always someone's drought in Australia. Absolutely, but then at the same time is recognising we're getting more bushfires, there's bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef, and is going, well, obviously something's going wrong. I don't really know what it is, but there's something going wrong there. And it's quite interesting to see how actually it's not that he wants to destroy everything, it's not that he wants a farm, he wants to have, he doesn't want severe droughts and all that damage that's happening, but actually it's working in this coal mine that's absolutely made him have to justify it because it's his living. And actually, when I've been arguing climate jobs with him, he does start to sort of change his mind about things. And you see how that changes in London with the XR protests. How within a week of London being shut down, the pollution went down, the air became cleaner, and suddenly you've got everyone in London who wasn't really talking about before, just ignoring the fact that it was so polluted, actually talking about this and talking about climate change, and actually, or maybe capitalism is having an impact. So you see in those little instances how actually it's not, it's not that it's human nature to want to destroy everything. Actually, it's our interests, it's our living conditions, our material conditions that really shape the way we look at the world. And having the arguments with people and arguing for socialism really can change that. So important that we're involved in these movements and doing that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to it the Anthropocene analysis, really, because there's also the issue of nuclear radiation. Sorry, it's not working, but the issue of nuclear radiation, I think, adds to the Anthropocene issue, because since the Second World War, I mean, we now have a condition where radioactive dust the radioactive isotopes made by humans, not naturally occurring, now cover the entire planet to a point where, from a geological point of view, you will be able to look back through the rest of history, supposing we survive, to be able to see this layer not simply of plastic, but actually of radiation, and a radiation that will last for hundreds of thousands of years, that actually is more polluting and more damaging to the environment. And I think that it's really important that socialists in the environment movement include this in our analysis and our understanding, and in our discussions. You know, it was James Lovelock's 100th birthday yesterday. He was on Radio 4 in the morning. This is the man who has brought a mysticism, in my view, to the environment movement by suggesting that Earth is Gaia and it has a sort of almost a sentience of its own that will restore the natural world, whatever humans do to it, and at our expense. Who was saying clearly one of the answers to the catastrophe is nuclear power. And of course nuclear power isn't the answer at all. It's linked directly to warfare and nuclear fallout from atomic blasts, etc. And when we look at Chernobyl, I don't know if anybody's seen the series on television, has some factual inadequacies, but nevertheless, if you look at the 2010-2012 maps of the whole of Eastern Europe and the radiation, the human-made radiation there, you've still got massive red spots that are going to be there for thousands of years. And so I think we have to add and make sure that in our discussions about climate and survival, that we actually add that there has to be no more nuclear as well as no more fossil fuel.
By Camilla, but I just kind of wanted to talk about actually what do we do now, and I think that has to kind of be part of the discussion. Like, I'm sure lots of us have seen the posters up about and heard about the strike for the climate, and I think it's quite right that it's branded that way, but in fact it's not just a strike for the climate, is it? It's actually it's a strike for human and animal and ecological survival. I think it's really brilliant that people are talking about supporting the school students. You know, I'm a journalist on socialist worker, and I've been lucky enough to report on the school's climate strikes, which have been absolutely inspirational. I think it's great that we've started to see some of that already through like lunchtime protests, you know, by workers, banners on demos and things like that. But I actually think we need to move beyond that now, and I think we need to start talking about joining them on strike. As workers, and not just remaining at this level of support, because actually it can kind of seem impossible, I think, you know, the idea of taking you know, unofficial strike action over this question. But when you see 1.5 million school students, teenagers, build a global movement and strike together, actually I would argue that in that current atmosphere, you know, anything is possible. Because they want workers there, they know the difference that workers can make, and they've become active literally over their question of survival. And you know, I don't think we should leave them to fight alone on this question any longer, because this is a group of activists who actually, they know that system change, most of them, or a lot of them, they know that system change in some form or another will be essential to saving you know, the planet in this real way, and I can't think of a better argument for being a socialist actually than fighting a system that is set to destroy us all.
The black shirt. Next to you.
Yeah, that was a great introduction by Camilla, and as she said, there's a lot of debate among Marxists working on ecology about whether or not to accept the concept of the Anthropocene, and I think that it's best just to cut through that argument. The kind of evidence that particularly Ian Angus assembles in his book, Facing the Anthropocene, makes clear, as Camilla said, what a break there is around the time of the Second World War. But if we want to follow through the kind of analysis that Camilla said, set forth, I think capitalism's relationship to fossil fuels is a very important part of the story. I mean, we've already had mention of coal, and Andreas Malm in his book Fossil Capital brings out in a very, very interesting way how important steam, and therefore coal, was to the Industrial Revolution, not primarily for technological reasons, but because, you know, if you relied instead on water as a power source, then you had to disperse your factories to wherever there was powerful enough currents of water. But once you've got steam power, you can locate your workers in cities, concentrate large numbers of workers, and in other words, the use of coal to power industry gave capital control over the production process in the way in which alternative power sources haven't. And I think you can follow that story through to what is clearly critical to the kind of takeoff of the Anthropocene in the middle of the 20th century, which is capitalism's increasing dependence on oil, on the internal combustion engine, on jet-powered aeroplanes and so on and so forth, that are so critical to the horrific growth in CO2 emissions. So I think this is a critical part of understanding why capitalism is such a generator of destructive climate change, and it's an important part when we talk about the Earth strike and so on and so forth. It's part of that, building for that is going to be talking about alternatives, and therefore we have to talk about how only socialism can make the necessary break with fossil capitalism.
Okay, I wanted to say something about the species extinction and the capitalism, and the fact that insects have been lost at, well, it's cataclysmic how many insects we have lost in the last 40 years. For instance, 98%, up to 98% of insects have gone from Puerto Rican rainforests. Up to 80% of insects have gone from Mexican dry forests, and 75% of insects have gone from German nature reserves. This is catastrophic. And the reason this has happened is because capitalism's response to the crisis of carcinogenic chemicals, particularly DDT, that Rachel Carson wrote about in The Silent Spring, was to create a new generation of weed killers called glyphosates and neonicotinoids. And the result of this has been that the glyphosates have destroyed habitats for insects, and neonicotinoids have created the bee colony collapse disorder and various other things. They have, this is what is wiping out the insects. And I think this is what we need to understand. I mean, following obviously from what Alex said, that the point of capitalism is to accumulate profit. And because that is its only reason to exist, it comes up with solutions to crises that it creates that don't interfere with profit. And so, glyphosates and neonicotinoids have been incredibly profitable, but they are wiping out the insects. And so ultimately, if we don't challenge capitalism, it is just going to get worse, and we are set at the moment to lose around 12.5% of all species on Earth. And this is before we even name and recognise some of these species. They're dying out. So we really don't have much choice. So when the students talk about this is a fight for our very survival, it's absolutely right.
Just wanted to talk briefly about the effect that the hugeness of the disaster has had on people. Several speakers have mentioned how things have accelerated in terms of environmental collapse, and we were talking in the breakout session there about the possibility of feedback loops, in other very non-linear rapid changes that may not yet have occurred, but that could very easily occur. The effect that those bits of information, if you like, have had is to broaden out hugely, it seems to me, the interest and support for taking quite radical action over the environment. Just a small example, but some of the people who have contacted us in my quite small union branch about the Earth strike and what we might do about it are people who aren't usually attenders at the AGM, or who aren't usually active in the union, but who have contacted one or two branch officers and said, what should we do about this? Will we be doing something about it? More widely, just to point to one particular argument, in the past it has often been emphasised amongst environmental activists that our own individual actions are the important way to change things. now what I've noticed in Extinction Rebellion in Manchester anyway, is that there is extreme, almost hostility to that idea. And while many of the people in XR or might themselves be vegan or might never set foot in an airport apart from to blockade it, but not to get on a plane, but nonetheless they're quite opposed to this notion that all you have to do is simply change your own lifestyle or reduce your own consumption of it. Sometimes almost to the point of being ultra-left about it seems to me. And that's quite refreshing, that people see change, system change, as being the way forward. It also means that in Extinction Rebellion, certainly in my experience, they're quite open to left and socialist ideas. They buy our papers, etc., and are quite open to us taking part in the movement. So, as others have said, we should do our absolute utmost to raise it amongst people around us to take effective action on the 20th, up to and including strike action.
Thanks very much. Two points. First, following from what Alice Kalinikos was saying about the centrality of fossil fuels, it seems to me that in relating to the environmental movement in general and Extinction Rebellion in particular, the key demand, the key concrete demand, is the demand to keep fossil fuels in the ground. This is an advantage from the fact that it comes from the movement itself. Greta Thunberg has said this and so on, and it cuts through all these people like the British government, the Irish government where I come from, declaring climate emergencies and doing nothing. In Ireland, People Before Profit has got a bill going through the Parliament to keep fossil fuels in the ground, and 1 minute the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar is saying we're all green and we're having a climate emergency. Next minute he's trying to sabotage that bill. It goes to the heart of the system, so that's very important. Second demand that I think is very important for us in concretising the idea of system change is for free public transport, expanded free public transport. This brings forward the argument for public ownership. It brings forward the argument for democratic planning. Expand our railways, they're the cleanest form of traffic, expand our bus services and so on. It's an inherently anti-capitalist, anti-Tory demand, and it makes sense to people in the current situation. Last point, if I've got time. This is getting extremely urgent, comrades. Extremely urgent. We were told 12 years. You look what's happening around the world, and catastrophe is coming not in 12 years' time, but every day, every week. This is you can't predict the exact time, but it's extremely urgent before we face major disaster. Okay.
Just 2 points. One is a comrade mentioned the Australian coal thing, her father and so on. When they closed down the coal industries here, they destroyed the towns and the communities which had depended on that from employment. To keep the fossil fuels in the ground is fantastically important, but we have to win that. That has to be won on the basis of better jobs, that people aren't made the victims of this. We don't destroy your communities, say, well, sorry mate, you're buggering up the environment, you have to. I come from Lowestoft. The fish went away, so there's no trawlers anymore. The light industry went away, and it's a devastated town. There's charity shops, and that's about it down the high street. Those communities and those industries are being devastated, and we have to have possibilities of people having decent employment that they can retrain in and what have you. Second of all, if I've time, I think the question we had, and this might sound beside all the point, we had a village hospital close, and there was a massive uprising of people within, huge demonstration within these villages nearby to where I live over this question. There is a bitterness and volatility, and it doesn't, we kind of think it's very difficult to organise strikes, the union bureaucracy, the anti-union laws, blah, 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 getting workers to do this stuff's going to be terrifically difficult and so on. But I think we have to be sensitive to the volatility and the possibility that because I believe opinion polls saying 65% of people are worried about what's going on in terms of this. This isn't something that is just some minority thing that we're thinking of. Loads of people are thinking about this stuff, and I think there's a volatility. I think there's a lot of people that might say, sorry, I'm coming out on that day if that's what's happening. Or at the very least, I'll join a lunchtime protest or something like that. So I think this is fantastically important. Thanks.
Just that one year we had up there.
Yeah, I think the role of the trade union movement in terms of bringing the organised working class into the movement to stop climate change is tremendously important. But we've got a battle on our hands. I'm a further education executive in Scotland, and we moved a motion saying support the strike on the 20th, etc., and our full-timer said, I'm sorry, this is not a legitimate industrial dispute. Fortunately, the full-timers thought that, but the rest of the executive voted it through unanimously. So, I mean, it doesn't mean it'll happen, because all the way along there's going to be battles and battles and battles, but it's a battle that we can actually win because people are with us. The other thing I wanted to say, the point that Camilla mentioned about the debates around the Anthropocene, and does it make it all humans are responsible for what's happening and therefore, you know, not the system. One of the school students in their strike speeches said, this is an internationalist issue. You cannot solve it on a national basis. And one of the things that clearly capitalism wants to do is see national states, you know, make America great again, trade wars, etc. It's state versus state. And actually, the concept of the Anthropocene enables you to get beyond that and say, it's not just a capitalist economy, it's a capitalist system of states, and they're going to fight each other rather than actually solve the collective problem. Only the working class can do that.
And then the last speaker will be comrade over there in the glasses.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, who did he say was next?
Young comrade on the side, yeah.
Hello. Just one quick point that I know comrade said about insects. I worked at an exotic zoo, and part of my time there was raising the fact that a lot of insects are going extinct, and people don't seem to care because they don't think they're important. And one thing that is capitalism's fault, everything's capitalism's fault, is that there was a mahogany tree that was analysed in Amazonia, and on that tree that was being cut down to come to London to be made into furniture, there was 30 species of insects that had never been identified. There was a praying mantis, which I can't remember the name, that had never ever been discovered. It was the first type of thing. It could be a revolution in science, and that tree still got cut down. After all the things we tried to stop it, it still got cut down, but people don't seem to care. And one thing I used to get asked a lot is, well, they're only insects, they can't be that important. Well, they are important, and capitalism doesn't care. And soon, elephants will be going extinct in more worlds, so it is about raising awareness and getting rid of capitalism more than anything.
Yeah, this one here.
I didn't know I was going to be the last speaker. Just a couple of comments. First of all, I got my copy of the book yesterday when I arrived, and I went back to our flat and reread Camilla's article last night. And boy, it really is good. Buy the book, read that article, that's terrific stuff. Thank you for writing it. As you know, some of you know, at least I wrote a book about the Anthropocene. It came out about 3 years ago. And this question of when it started continues to haunt the discussions among scientists, but even more among radicals. There tends to be two approaches. One is, when did human beings start changing the world? And of course, by that definition, we started changing the world when we came down out of the trees. And there are, in fact, people who will argue that if you're going to say Anthropocene, you've just got to talk about the entire period when humans existed on the world. The other question that's raised, the other way of approaching that, which is the core of the argument among geologists and the main people on this, is when did those changes become qualitative? At what point did we did our species, through whatever social systems that we were involved in, actually start to make qualitative changes in the way the Earth system works? And we've done various things over our time on this planet, but since 1945 it's been nuts. And that's what I think is why you see the geologists in particular saying roughly 1950. And now we're trying to figure out what's the marker. And that's really important to geologists because they need to be able to look at a rock 10,000 years from now and say, that's 1950 right there. So that's why they look at things like radiation. Not that they say radiation changed the world, but that's when the marker is there. What I have been struck by since I published the book is how much more research there has been and how much more evidence there is that capitalism has radically changed the Earth system since the middle of the 20th century. The current issue of Monthly Review is an article by me called Superbugs in the Anthropocene, and it's about the whole role of antibiotics and antibiotic resistance, which is very much a post-World War II phenomenon. Also much around agriculture, the emergence of industrial agriculture on a large scale is a basically post-1950 phenomenon. The mass destruction of fisheries is very much a late 20th century phenomenon. So again and again, what you see is that capitalism, which has always been an incredibly destructive system, its destructive level became way greater around the middle of the 20th century, and it's getting worse all the time.
So Camilla, I'll bring you back in.
So a couple of speakers have emphasised that capitalism itself goes through changes during the course of its existence, and one of those changes is how it's changed itself since the Second World War. And thanks for raising that. I think it's a good argument, and people should read Ian's article in Monthly Review. It's very good and very widely discussed about just how much antibiotic use has changed, even the DNA of the bacteria around us, essentially, really, to the point where we're finding new bacteria that are resistant not just to the antibiotic they've been exposed to, but to a wide range of antibiotics. So it's quite extraordinary, quite worrying. You also see things like plastics. It's another example of how things have changed since the Second World War. Pre-war it was more common for people to reuse things like bottles and to take paper bags to the shops and things like that. I mean, because of a concerted effort on the part of the petrochemicals companies and companies like Coca-Cola to expand the use of non-recyclable packaging and plastic packaging, we've seen this massive expansion in its use, and it's all to get their products further distributed and to advertise as well. It's not for any kind of not for plastic use isn't because it's needed. So I think people are also right to talk about humans have changed the environment for the whole of our history, but we're really interested in when did these changes become global, when did they become system-wide and actually affect the way that the Earth system works. And I think it is credible that happened in the middle of the 20th century. People have talked about nuclear power. I agree we should be against nuclear power for many reasons. I mean, we always say it's dirty, dangerous, and expensive. People might remember the Fukushima disaster where you had the tsunami that affected the nuclear power station, and people, one of my memories of that was that workers were being sent in to try and clean up all the water that had been polluted with uranium, but they weren't given the proper safety gear, so workers were being asked to risk their health to go and clean up that nuclear power station. I think we should also be concerned about uranium mining and the effect of that in places like North America and Australia, and the effect on the local environment and people's health in those areas, often affecting indigenous communities. I do think it's right though, it's not to sort of counterpose the two, but I do think we need to treat fossil fuel consumption as absolutely central to this problem. The fossil fuel companies, of the 10 biggest companies in the world, most of them are fossil fuel companies, I think. And I think, to put it very concretely, we can't allow them to carry on digging up coal or oil or gas and burning it. There was one study that was a few years ago that said that you need to leave 80% of the known fossil fuels in the ground in order to avoid 2 degrees of warming. They weren't even looking at what was needed to keep it at 1.5 degrees. So I think the people in Ireland are absolutely right to concretely say let's keep them in the ground and not have any further fossil fuel exploration. I think just to sort of end on, I mean, there were lots of really great contributions. I think, someone talked about insects and, do people really care about what's happening to the insect population? Are they informed enough? But I think people are becoming increasingly informed. People are starting to realise and to actually notice what's happening to the insects. I think even there are certain roads that, I remember comrades telling me there was a certain road they used to drive down in their area and used to always get loads of insects on your windscreen, and that doesn't happen anymore. It's noticeable what's happening now, and people are getting, people are starting to use less plastic in their everyday life and to start to plant plants that are more attractive to insects. I know these aren't going to solve the problem, but what I'm saying is that this is a measure of how much public opinion is changing and how people are starting to become more aware of what's happening. But I think, as people have said, one of the most refreshing things about Extinction Rebellion and about the school strikes as well, actually, because they're incredibly angry and their focus is largely on our government and the lack of action from the Tory government, quite rightly. But one of the most refreshing things about them is that they're not just about blaming individuals. That's one of the core tenets of Extinction Rebellion, that we don't want to just moralise and guilt-trip individuals, and they recognise that that's not going to be enough to solve the problem. And I think that the kind of radical vision of system change is one of the things that has brought many people into that. So I'd encourage people to go away and to start being part of the various movements around climate change.